Let's have a quick look at some patterns of evolution. We'll go through one by one. We'll start off with convergent evolution. Now, we can ask ourselves, what does converge actually mean? Converge means to come together, right? So what we're talking about, organisms that have seemed to have come together in terms of the traits that they have. So the organisms may have started out here. Let's say, let's call this one A, this can be B, but at the end product is that they look very similar. So they've started from very different places. That's a key point about convergent evolution, is that how they got to their physical characteristics, their traits that they express now, that happened through very different evolutionary pathways. A good example of convergent evolution, possibly my favorite example, is the shark and the dolphin. Now these organisms have a number of features in common, or we should say they're similar in a number of ways. One way is the actual body shape. They are fusiform in shape. Now what we mean by fusiform is essentially this: thin at the front, fatter in the middle, thinner at the end. So both of these have a fusiform body shape. They both have these pectoral fins here. We have a dorsal fin on the back. We've got a nice strong caudal fin, the tail fin. They're both very streamlined for moving through the water. Now, these two animals actually evolved through very different evolutionary pathways. The shark, that evolved from this guy, and no, I don't mean the little boy. He would be mine. No, the shark evolved from placoderms, basically armored fishes like this Dunkleosteus that Declan's holding here. Now, this occurred about 450 or so million years ago. Dolphins, on the other hand, are very recent. Dolphins are whales. They are toothed whales, Odontoceti, and they actually evolved from this guy. This is Pakicetus. Well, this is what we think Pakicetus looked like. Now, this occurred a mere 60 or so million years ago when land mammals decided, hey, you know what, stuff this, I'm going back to the water. So they did. Okay, evolution's not quite that simple, but yes, whales are evolved from land mammals very recently through a much different evolutionary pathway to sharks. And yet, now, sharks and dolphins have, as I pointed out, a number of similarities in terms of their physical characteristics, their traits. Here's another example of evolution. This is divergent evolution. Now, converge was coming together. Diverge is to move apart. So in this case, we can think of starting with one organism, but then that diverges into different organisms. So we may end up with, let's say, a B over here and a C over here. So we end up with different species, but they have diverged from a common ancestor. Now, a good example of divergent evolution is the horse, the zebra, and the donkey. I think you'd all agree they have fairly similar characteristics. They actually evolved about 4, maybe 4.5 million years ago from this guy. This is Platypus. So the Platypus diverged out into the 3 different species that we have now: the horse, the zebra, and the donkey. Another pattern of evolution is that of adaptive radiation. Now, adaptive radiation kind of looks like this. Now, we've seen this before. We called it divergent evolution. Well, here's the thing about adaptive radiation. Essentially, it is divergent evolution, but it happens much more quickly. Adaptive radiation is fast. One good example of this is Darwin's finches, the 14 finches that Darwin observed that he first thought were completely unrelated, just different birds, and then he later came to realize that actually they had diverged from a common species, but this happened pretty quickly, so this is adaptive radiation. Another example of adaptive radiation is, of course, the Cambrian explosion. Boom! No, I don't mean this one, I mean more this type of thing. So this occurred about 540 million years ago in the Cambrian time period. So this is known as the Cambrian explosion, where essentially all body plans that we have present today, they were formed here. So there was an absolute just explosion and diversification of life on the planet. That's the Cambrian explosion, another example of adaptive radiation. Another pattern of evolution is that of parallel evolution. This, if we go back to our arrows, funnily enough, looks like this, parallel lines. Now, what we have here are similar ancestors, or may have been a common ancestor a long time ago, but then the organisms have been separated, but they evolved along similar lines. So a good example of this are these two guys right here. Now on the left we have the northern flying squirrel. This is a placental mammal. Now on the right we have a sugar glider. This is an Australian marsupial mammal. So we've got placental mammals and marsupial mammals. Now placentals and marsupials, there are lots of examples where the marsupials and placentals have very similar traits. Like you can see here, they both have this nice little flap of skin that they can, glide through the air on. They've both got nice furry bodies, very large eyes. These were actually both nocturnal, so the large eyes make sense for them. So we've got a number of traits that are in common or that are very similar, but they evolved different continents over a very long time. They weren't evolving together. But because they share similar habits and a similar niche, they evolved similar traits. So that's parallel evolution. Now, another pattern of evolution is coevolution. What is this whole co-business? Well, co generally means together. Think company or cooperate. It's people working together, isn't it? So coevolution is where organisms evolve together. Not just at the same time or at the same place, but literally because of each other. So in this case, and if we're using our arrows, we might have one organism evolves in this way, and because of that evolution of that one organism, that causes another organism to evolve, and that causes that first organism to evolve a bit more, and that might cause the second organism to keep evolving. So the coevolution is organisms evolving in a reciprocal fashion because of another organism. Now, one example of this is the chrysanthemum plant. Now, this plant produces pyrethrin. It does this because caterpillars are quite happy to go, munch on the leaves, and that's not so good for the plant. But what the plant has is this toxin, that's pyrethrin. So the plant produces pyrethrin. Now this is essentially a poison to most insects, right? To all these caterpillars. So that caterpillar can't go munch because he's going to die. So what has happened is that some of these larvae or the caterpillars have actually evolved an enzyme which detoxifies the pyrethrin. So they have evolved over time an enzyme which, because it detoxifies the pyrethrin, that allows them to eat the plant again without being killed off by that toxic chemical that the plant has produced. So, not so good for the plant, once again. But wait, not the end of the story. Now, some chrysanthemum plants have actually developed this another chemical called sesamin. Now, sesamin is actually an inhibitor of the enzyme that the caterpillar had. So this is sesamin. Now these arrows are getting a little bit mixed up now, but anyway, so we've got pyrethrin, stops the caterpillars, kills them off, but then the caterpillars evolved this enzyme. They developed this enzyme which breaks down the toxic pyrethrin so they can eat the plant again, but then the plant makes the sesamin, which is an inhibitor of the enzyme, so the caterpillar can't break down the pyrethrin anymore, so now it can't eat the plant again, so that arrow is gone. So what we see here is coevolution, one organism evolving in response to another organism. Okay, a couple more things. Firstly, gradualism. Let's say we want to start here and we want to get to there. One idea of evolution is this gradualism, this gradual change. So we're talking, I'm just going to go this way, I will eventually get there. It's pretty slow going, it's a slow process, but there we go, I've got there. So that's gradualism. It happens over a very long time, lots of very small changes going on. This next one, our last one, is punctuated equilibrium. What is this all about? Well, let's take a quick look. Equilibrium means sort of like in balance, right? Not changing, it's in balance. And punctuated, it's more sort of like a start-stop type fashion. So let's have the same deal that we had before with gradualism. Gradualism, very slow changes over a long time. Punctuated equilibrium says that, you know what, maybe there was quite a bit of time where nothing really changed, but then suddenly a lot changed, and then we were stable, the population was stable for a time, and then over a brief time, a lot changed again, and then we had stability, this equilibrium, and then there was a lot of change, and then equilibrium, and then a lot more change. So it's much more of a bigger step type thing. So gradualism, there's constant small changes. The evolution is consistently happening in the population, whereas punctuated equilibrium, the population is stable for a long time, and then very quickly there's a lot of change. Now, very quickly, it might be, let's say, from 5 to 50,000 years. Now, that sounds like quite a long time to us, but remember, evolution is a slow process. So, in the grand scheme of things, 20, 30, 50,000 years is actually a blink of an eye. That's nothing for evolution. So that's the difference there between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. So there are some different patterns of evolution that we observe. Okay, so we have this. Let's go back to convergent evolution, where the traits of organisms are converging into their similarity. And a good example was the shark and the dolphin. We have divergent evolution, where we start with one species and that species can diverge off and we end up with two different species. Now, there's actually a good word for this we should probably mention as well. This is speciation. Speciation is the forming of new species through this divergent evolution. So one organism diverges out, we end up eventually with different species at the end of the day. And a good example of this divergent evolution was Platypus diverging out into what we have now. We have the horse, the zebra, and the donkey. We have adaptive radiation. This is essentially the same thing, but it happens much more quickly. And so Darwin's finches are a good example. The Cambrian explosion is another good example. Then we had some parallel evolution. This is where organisms started with a similar ancestor. Let's just add a couple of letters on this. Maybe that started with an A, and this also started with an A, but look, they're different A's, right? But they're similar. And we end up at a B and a B, but a capital and a lowercase. So again, the organisms are different, but their ancestors were similar, and they evolved in a similar fashion, right? Because they had similar habits, living in a similar niche, etc. We've got coevolution, where one organism is evolving in a reciprocal fashion with another organism, and the plant here producing pyrethrin, and then the caterpillar producing an enzyme to take on that pyrethrin, so it could still eat the plant, but then the plant producing sesamin to inhibit the action of the enzyme, so the pyrethrin still did its job, etc. So one organism evolving because of another. Gradualism, lots of small changes. It's a pretty consistent thing. It just takes like a really, really long time. Versus punctuated equilibrium, you know what? Not a lot changes. The population is stable, and then suddenly there's this small time frame where there's lots of change, and then the population stabilizes again. But then later on down the track, there's a small time period again, lots of change, etc. So there we go, patterns of evolution.
Don't forget to hit the like button. Yeah. And subscribe too. It's up here.
Hey Grace's dad, that means you.
And here's another video.